When it comes to card game mechanics, Yu-Gi-Oh can easily be considered as the most unique. Instead of focusing on the standard color wheel that other TCGs have, Yu-Gi-Oh blows that out of the water and explores in depth into a specific group of cards and builds them out from the ground up. Unfortunately though, since Yu-Gi-Oh could be considered as a pioneer of this concept, it comes as a mixed bag. While I think praise is due for diving into a completely different mechanic that is different from all TCGs, allowing this game to be able to thrive, unfortunately, due to that exact same concept and other intricacies around it, Konami has created a problem out of something that could be way better than what it currently is. In case you guys don't know who I am, hi, I'm your professor, TheCaliEffect, and today we're going to be diving in the huge issue that is known as Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes. I have to say, there are some amazing things about it that gives this whole card game life, but at the same time, there are some huge problems that need to be addressed. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Now, when I said that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the most unique TCG in the entire world, I actually want to double down on that. I want to go ahead and say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is by far the #1 card game in the entire world, and it's not even close. Don't argue with me, argue with your mama. Granted, it's not to say that this card game doesn't have a litany of issues, it genuinely does, but even in its problems, like this particular one, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has an amazing thing going for it that when fixed, it can be a very beautiful thing. Allow me to break it down. Yu-Gi-Oh's archetype design is different than any other card game. And the roots of it, the method of its characterization that doubles as a way of evocative gameplay is crazy. I think the biggest appeal for Yu-Gi-Oh over the other card games is simply the archetypes. I especially love that the characterization or the cards of the particular theme double as a way that you play the game. This is one of the major things that players love about Yu-Gi-Oh! And is one of the biggest weapons that it has in its arsenal, as other card games wouldn't even try to mimic the way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Goes about things. Instead, other card games go in favor of a color pie. For example, if you play just about any other card game, you'll notice that these particular card games define their creatures or monsters in a specific color. This makes cards incredibly easy to identify and even easier to figure out which cards work with them, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Has no such thing. In fact, the closest thing for Yu-Gi-Oh! That would be that color pie would be the attributes on the top right corner, but those really don't denote if those cards play well together at all. Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes the art, the cards, and the name way further than any other card game. And for my people that know, it pretty much says that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. You really gotta know. Let me give you another example. Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes are often inspired by media, pieces of genre, or general concepts, and those inspirations help you immerse yourself into the game. I actually think that a really good archetype to represent this would be Gravekeepers. While people know that Gravekeepers are based off of ancient Egypt and religious ceremonies, a lot of people don't know that the Gravekeeper monsters actually tie into the original show. That's right. Merrick, Ashizu, and Odeon are all Gravekeeper monsters who are actually called Tomb Keepers in charge of keeping the tomb safe for the next pharaoh. When you tie all these pieces of media together, you actually get a strategy that is focused on locking down or protecting the graveyard. A strategy whose cards are primarily Dark and Spellcaster monsters, and while they can gain benefits from being Dark and Spellcasters, they take the most advantage of being Gravekeeper monsters. When you play them together, they get even stronger. It's one of the prime examples of when Yu-Gi-Oh! Does archetypes right. And it's not to say that Pokemon or Magic don't do something similar. They actually do an amazing job of incorporating media and genres and stuff like that themselves. But as you can see, the color in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which would be the attribute, takes a completely different role. If anything, it takes a back seat to what the theme is. It's something that accentuates the strategy and doesn't define what it is. While if you look on the flip side, both games, Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, are severely limited because they're colors. Now granted, you can play more than one color. In fact, a lot of Pokemon and Magic decks play more than one color or energy. I'm pretty sure in other card games like Lorcana, the limit is 2, but even if it weren't, there is a really big problem when you mix multiple colors inside of different decks. You see, since these other card games are color and resource based, the more you pull to a different color, you actually take away from your deck, making it inconsistent. Since Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have that exact same restriction, it can actually feel a little bit more free. But unfortunately, that exact same freedom has become a huge problem in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I won't lie, a few years before, it was actually a non-factor. Taking one Yu-Gi-Oh archetype and mixing it with 2 or 3 others could potentially make it stronger. But the big drawback with that before was because since archetypes required so much space, you would run the risk of drawing multiple pieces of both of your archetypes and not a way to be able to consistently stop your opponent. And then a lot of times in Yu-Gi-Oh with these particular decks, you would pray to draw just one particular archetype instead of the other, which pretty much disincentivized players for playing multiple archetypes. But pretty much all of that has changed since Konami has moved towards making archetypes a lot more sleek. Because modern Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes not only don't require a lot of space and are also typically 1-card combos, there are often times in situations where players can play multiple engines or multiple archetypes inside of their deck and are fairly successful with it. It's actually really interesting how math changes when your deck requires 2 cards to make a combo as opposed to 1. This has allowed players to mix the best of the best cards with one another, meaning that Yu-Gi-Oh can often feel like the monotonous same soup of cards that people are playing. It can feel incredibly draining to play against a deck like Yugioh, which is an Exceed-based Yu-Gi-Oh deck, but then it incorporates the Fiendsmith cards, which allow it to be able to fusion summon, and those just happen to be some of the best cards in the game. And they also happen to be 1-card combos in themselves. And then only to turn around and play against a deck like Malice, which is a 1-card combo Yu-Gi-Oh deck that also incorporates the Fiendsmith cards and the Bestial archetype simply because it can. Players are incredibly frustrated because Konami okayed a particular situation where these incredibly powerful cards can work in tandem with one another. But I think what makes players even angrier is the next problem. While modern Yu-Gi-Oh strategies like Yugioh have a restriction, the restriction can almost be laughed at. Preventing you from Exceed summoning is actually a pretty good restriction, but it's almost null and void when the prevention of Exceed summoning only applies for the rest of the turn, meaning that you can take advantage of every other type of summoning mechanic, and when your opponent wears down their resources, you follow up with this 1-card combo that allows you to get into your Exceed cards. But I think what is equally as frustrating for Yu-Gi-Oh players is that not all archetypes are built the same. In fact, the disparity on how Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes are treated is almost a cry. Konami 100% cherry picks on what cards they want to be very powerful and generic almost, and what cards can't be. I think if we go back to that base example, with Yugioh only locking you to Exceed summoning for the rest of the turn, and Malice locking you into Link summoning, but only for the rest of the turn. All of this may have been okay if other archetypes had the exact same opportunity. Red Dragon Archfiend is an old school Yu-Gi-Oh deck that was just modernized last year. It actually has 1-card combos in itself, but its restrictions are a lot different. In order for you to take advantage of this 1-card combo, you can't special summon anything except for Dark Dragon monsters during the entire turn you're playing this deck. A complete different and outrageous far cry when you compare it to Yugioh and Malice and other strategies alike. This not only furthers the disparity of archetypes being incredibly good and other archetypes not being good enough, Konami even doubles down on this by making archetypes that are so restrictive they're almost unplayable. There's another Yu-Gi-Oh archetype named Nimlaria, and this strategy is so incredibly restrictive, it's almost pitiful. This deck Xenolocks you when it's at its most inconvenient, and for people that don't know what Xenolocking is, it's pretty much preventing you from doing anything other than what the mechanic was designed to do, and even if the Nimlaria cards weren't so restrictive, they wouldn't have been good anyways. And then there's the Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes that Konami produces that never really get support. A good example of this is Vanquish Soul, a strategy built off of fighting games and actually has a really cool theme to it. This deck's fighting combos are based off of the attributes that you have in the hand and actually has a tag out mechanic that you would get from certain fighting games. Really cool. And while this Yu-Gi-Oh archetype doesn't have the same restrictions of Yugioh, Malice, or Red Dragon Archfiend, it makes up for it for being an incredibly high skilled Yu-Gi-Oh deck and really hard to master. This archetype shows that even without restrictions, Konami can make a Yu-Gi-Oh strategy that's fair and balanced but still really good. Because despite all of this, Vanquish Soul was actually strong enough to have success at some of the most hardest events in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Until it wasn't. Vanquish Soul, like many other archetypes, went under-supported and then unfortunately power crept. It just goes to show that Konami has multiple angles at balance, and instead of restricting Yu-Gi-Oh strategies the same or providing support to strategies that require a ton of skill to play, they forego that in favor of their own agenda. In fact, what can be considered the craziest or biggest issue about this is how Konami doesn't even finish archetypes, and instead of making them playable decks, they force them to be engines. It's really weird how some Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes can't even be full decks by themselves, and they have to be supported by other Yu-Gi-Oh strategies and are oftentimes generic pieces to power creep other strategies out of the game. The bestial monsters are a prime example. The bestial monsters have the power of hand trap monsters, which we already talked about why players hate those in a different Yu-Gi-Oh video. They also have the benefit of no restriction while simultaneously taking advantage of Yu-Gi-Oh's two biggest attributes in the entire game. Oftentimes, these Yu-Gi-Oh archetype engines, as players would like to call them, are used to propel the game way faster than it would and should be, while also preventing some of the older strategies from being able to compete. And it's incredibly obvious when Konami does this, because they don't even attempt to make this archetype engine its very own deck. Not only does it compound the first two issues, it really does help take away from something that can be really beautiful. Because archetypes are the focal point of Yu-Gi-Oh! But when you don't penalize players from playing all of the best archetypes together with one another, you unfairly boost the power of certain Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes while restricting the power of others, and you create generic Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes to only propel the game forward. We all lose in Yu-Gi-Oh!